Hi everyone, welcome to Opsin Webcast. My name is James Pham. I am the CEO and co-founder of Opsin. We save enterprises from data exposure risk, insider risk, and agentic risk in using enterprise AI like Microsoft 365 Copilot, ChatGPT Enterprise, and Code. With me here today, I'm very honored and excited to have two very awesome CISO, Trey Tunnell and Anatoli. So Trey, why don't you go ahead and introduce a little bit more about yourself before we get into the webcast?
Yeah. Thanks, James. My name's Trey Tunnell. I'm with Floor and Decor. We're a 270 store big box chain of hard surface flooring retailer. I've been with Floor and Decor for about 6 years. Been in retail IT my entire career, and just really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you, Trey, Anatoli.
I'm Anatoli Lataria. I'm Chief Information and Digital Officer at MiTek. And I joined MiTek about 3 years ago in the role of a CISO. And, cybersecurity is my passion. I didn't want to let that go. And so that's still, part of my responsibilities. Just as a background, just risk management is really kind of, and cybersecurity is my passion, how I think through different things. And in today's world, I guess it's been very helpful to have that type of mindset.
Video.
Yeah, definitely. All right, agents. Everyone talk about agents, right? It's agent doing this, agent doing that. Like everyone talking about agents, and in fact, in enterprise right now, I see a lot of all right, how do we get agent to help with productivities? So maybe before we go into the security framework of it, just wanted to hear you guys talk a little bit more about the agentic adoption, what you guys are seeing, what your concerns there before we get into what agents and what the risks around it.
Yeah, just first of all, just this field, right? This space, being in a technology space right now is like the most exciting field to be, right? Because things change every day, multiple times a day. And, this whole space, AI has been, machine learning has been out for a long time, but obviously exploded with generative AI. And the kind of the next iteration has been, introduction of agents now, right? So instead of it being used as a chat to have a conversation, or maybe using AI models for creating different memes or something. Right now, it has translated into more of an enterprise environments where some agents, as the time passes, they can act as an employee as well, right? So now, with an employee, you can have a conversation, you can have policies, and they also have some things that they have to decide on. But with agents, that kind of gets obfuscated. It's becoming more of a black box as well, as the new frontier models get released. So there's just a lot of unknown right now in this space. And I know we'll talk about some of the risks that exist, but that's one of the challenges. Every day something new comes out, and it's scary and exciting at the same time. So that's kind of my take on this.
Are you more scared or more excited?
I'm more of a hey, I'm more of a risk taker. So
Yeah.
it's real. No, it's almost like riding a scary roller coaster right now. So I'm screaming, but I'm not sure if it's screams of joy or fear. It's kind of mixed at the same time.
But you're screaming. That's
Right. I just know I'm screaming. That's right.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of in the same boat. I'm very, we're very keen on the idea of enabling our business, right? It feels like the world has moved on from, we're not the Department of No anymore. We're here to find ways to use technology to do everybody's job better. And this is probably the most pivotal thing. I mean, this is such an impactful time that we're in right now, because you're right, there are just so many unknowns. And I'm more excited than I am concerned. I'm definitely concerned. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of things that we need to put into place before I would feel comfortable with where we are from an agentic perspective. But the idea of creating these little mini trays that can go out and do work for me, it's a force multiplier. It has such a potential to impact everything that we do every day. So I'm just really excited. But yeah, there's a ton of stuff that we don't know and a ton of stuff that's scary. But I'm just more. I think I'm a little more excited than I am worried.
Yeah, I think that's the sentiment, especially that I live in Silicon Valley. Like every time I go out, there's a billboard talking about like, do not hire a human, for example. Like
Yeah.
everyone have this idea of like, all right, agent gonna replace employees. Maybe it's just a marketing stunt, but it true to some degree, right? Because it's gonna multiply and enable the employees in the enterprise to be more productive. I think the tricky bit about agents is that those are becoming increasingly autonomous without human in the loop. Some have human in the loop, some like without. And these agents are taking actions. It Gen 2 calls, right? Like, so it's not just like a single API call, like it can like make API call to this, dependent result, move to the next one. And it's kind of like expose a lot of unknowns, like what you guys said about the risk itself. So it touched the question of who is authorized to take that action. What was the general accountability? Like who is responsible for it? Is it the identity of the employees, or that the the IT team that deploy these agents, right? So all of that kind of expose a lot of question around like identity, intent, action chain, behavior, account, um, owner accountabilities, and like mapping these to emerging standards so that practitioner can have some kind of place to anchor. But before we get into this framework and risk framework about agents, I wanted to take a pause here and hear what you guys think about like what kind of risk, what kind of concern that you have about these unknowns.
Anatoli, you want to take it? You want me to go?
Go for it this time. Yeah, we'll
Yeah, all
alternate.
right.
How about
We'll
that?
alternate. That works. That
Okay.
works. Um, so I mean, in my opinion, the it's very critical, and again, the identity is one of the biggest challenges, right? Because each of these agents has the potential to have a lot of power. So we are doing everything we can to ensure that the access is limited to what the user of the agent is allowing, so that I can't go in as as an employee and look up somebody else's pay, or I can't look up somebody else's whatever. So we're trying to control those things. The challenge is when you need these really super powerful agents that have uncommon access to do things that need to be done. That is what is really more, a little more terrifying to me. And in those cases, we're much more human in the loop, human over the loop. We're doing a lot of things to make sure that at least a human is part of the conversation. But those days are numbered, right? I mean, ultimately, everything is moving. It seems to be moving towards agentic. So trying to find ways to build those boundaries and build those controls and guide rails inside the application, and that's kind of where we're going to deal with that as much as we can throughout the process, so that we're not over provisioning somebody's access.
Yeah, one thing I would add, how I think about this, right, is just any security problem, right? Visibility is key. You have to know what's happening, what's going on, right? Identity is key. Role-based access. What are you actually giving these agents access to, and how do you limit it? And let's talk about configuration, right? So visibility, identity, configuration. That's kind of in any kind of tool that you have in your environment. The challenge that's happening right now, it's completely, principles are the same, but the actions are a little bit different now. It's more of a black box as well, right? There's stories, maybe agents finding ways to bypass some of the controls that exist, right? Another one is, a specific agent might be created for a specific use case. So let's say maybe intent of the agent is for it to return some policy information, HR policies, vacation, things like that. But some kind of misconfiguration can happen somewhere that people didn't know about it, but agent found a way to exploit it in a way and use it not how it was intended, and all of a sudden that agent can start doing other things, right? There's prompt injections that are happening. There's plenty things out there that are on the internet showing that some companies release an agent for end users to use, but then tap into it and start using LLM prompts get output, right? So that's the big challenge now, like just the whole idea of what something was created for, what use case it was created to achieve. There's a little bit of loss of control, that it can get out of control and agent can drift and start doing different things. And obviously there's a lot of bad guys out there that are trying to exploit that. And a lot of, today within enterprises, a lot of our control systems, architectures were designed with an assumption that you either have a human interacting with the system or a system account, right? Not that there's a whole agent now that's kind of making a bridge between all of these things and does different things. So that's kind of the the concerning area, so to speak, emerging area, and the kind of the risks that there's a lot of unknowns there still, and we're learning as an industry, I think, as a lot of new innovations are coming out.
Yeah, definitely. And what you highlighted is very accurate, right? Because a lot of the control that you have, it was designed for the world that doesn't have agents.
Right.
So there are a couple of
Right.
changes. Yeah, so there are a couple of changes that happen, right? So one is that agents are somewhat non-deterministics, like your usual like policy regular expressions might not work on something that is non-deterministics in a way. And then the second thing is that the traditional security patterns is usually like man in the middle, right? Like you across the boundary and then we intercept it and block it. But a lot of the agents nowadays, it either happen locally, like a cloud co-work, or on the server side. Like if you create a managed agent on the server side, so like a lot of actions like tool calls, access data, and all of that happen on the server side. So it's like super tricky for you to kind of like, all right, what's my traditional security solution can do about it? Because the user sent a prompt and they got the responses back, but the traditional security tools would not be able to see what happened on the server side on the other side, right? So I think it breaks a lot of kind of traditional control that we have. And from what you Trey from and Anatoli, from both what you guys discussed is how like identities is important to kind of give visibility. And then the second thing that I pick up from what you guys said is intent. Like it's a HR policy agent supposed to do this, is supposed to do that, right? So let's dive a little bit deeper into those topics and kind of like see what we can do there. So like the first thing is around identity and visibility. So maybe Anthony, like if you can share a bit more like what you're thinking there, like how we as industry bets doing it, and are there a particular framework that you follow, or it's still too early to have those kind of NIST and so on framework to follow at this point?
Yeah, and we can spend some time on frameworks. There's different frameworks out there. The intent of what they're trying to address is different, right? Some are more governance frameworks, some are compliance frameworks, and some are, they do provide some specifics, right? OWASP has a little bit more prescriptive controls that can exist. But if we kind of take a step back and just talk about, identities, right? So, you always had, human identities and, how we protected those, and existing challenge then has been kind of non-human identities, but specifically service accounts and how you manage that. And we've been as an industry trying to spend a lot of time how to properly secure those. But now this whole agentic identity is even slightly different, right, than just a generic service account identity, right? So it's kind of completely new construct that's coming up. And sometimes the question is, it's not just about what access that agentic identity is given, but how can it it gets access to different layers of information, especially there's different tools that an agent can call and reference and kind of do different things. And historically a lot of times you can harness maybe service accounts and things like that at the network layer as well. You have kind of network boundaries, you have segmentation that you do, but as soon as now you kind of granted access to tools that you might not even know all the capability that that tool has, whether it's MCP servers or plugins, whatever that might be, that identity sprawl, kind of where it grows even farther, right? You kind of losing control. I mean, ideally, I would love the identity to be kind of reevaluated anytime, not just at the network boundary, but at the tool hub that happens, right? You're calling a new different MCP server. There's some kind of validation. maybe, if all of a sudden it's getting access to, piece of data maybe the user originally didn't have intent to access, is there some kind of elevation of privilege that's being asked? But that's a problem as well. Trey, you mentioned, I'm over the same mind. We want to enable the business, right? So if an agent is constantly asking you for permissions all the time, and you have to constantly watch it and click on these things and try to evaluate it, that's also going to speak to outcome that you're trying to get to, and eventually teams will find other ways of interacting with that agent. So it's a delicate balance, and I personally haven't found anything that has solved this problem. That's probably not news to anybody, right? But that is problem to be solved for sure.
Yeah, Anatoli, I agree with you, and I think that the key that I picked up on was reevaluation at every hop. Right? If I'm going from one agent to another, the new agent needs to understand my intent, the original context of my request, and what should I have access to. And that's agree, and I agree. We do not have a way to solve that right now. And so really that's why, I go back to we're kind of laying down we're identifying what the original user has access to and trying to mimic as much of that as possible. But at some point that doesn't scale. Right. We've got to find a way to better analyze at every hop what really, and it's not just identity, it's a lot of other things that need to be analyzed at every hop. So I think this is a pretty big area of risk that we have, because the visibility and the control is not there at each individual hop right now.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of tend to agree with you guys. Right. So a lot of the current design patterns is that agents who inherit the permission of the owners itself. Like let's say if you have an employees in marketing, you create an agent, say a lot of the permission and control is inherit from the users, right? Like so, I'm of the opinion that agent should have its own identity, should have its own scope. Because imagine, right, like in the enterprises, there will be more agents than employees. And it kind of get to that problem that you mentioned, Anatoly, because like if you just keep asking employees or a creator to approve permission every single time, they got tired and they just click yes.
Right. There's a
Yeah.
fatigue, right? There was MFA fatigue. There was all these things. So absolutely. I don't know. It's definitely a challenge that needs to be addressed. And that's sometimes we as security professionals miss, is sometimes we tend to try to address a risk, right? But then
Yeah.
if it breaks the flow that an individual has, what's their workflow and things like that, they'll find ways to get around it, right? So
Yeah.
designing some of these controls in a way that provides the safety, provides the mechanisms, provides a harness, so to speak, but doesn't break their flow of what they're trying to achieve, is definitely helpful. And we talked about identity and kind of limiting to what they have access to, you know, but what's happening as well, there's also data sprawl in the organizations, right? So, traditionally in a SaaS-based application, yes, you can have role-based access, you can limit what they can access to, and in an enterprise organization, you can limit what you have access to, but there might be some wrong access permissions that exist somewhere in the architecture, right? Somewhere within your environment. Uh, Historically, if the user didn't know how to get to it, they would have never got to it. Today, agents can crawl your environment and yes, access information or data or something, an environment that was never intended for that user to access in the first place. But guess what? Agent will discover it and will get access to it and will be interesting, right? And then it try to use it. So those are the big existing challenges today as well.
Yeah, and to Trey point earlier, right? Like you got to be the enabler of the business and allow the business to be more productive. Then the question is about like how do we control this risk? And to you guys' point, right? Like AI, it is powerful engine that can go and see pretty much everything in your environments like instantly. um, and like back to the example of like an HR policy agents, but like if someone accidentally attach, say that some data set about employee salary or like social security number, and then there's someone that used that agent and accidentally, oh well, now I know, like previously I know it's out there, I just don't know where, but now I know it.
Right.
Right. So it's get into all this idea of like what's the intent of these agents and how people are using it. And to your point, Trey, about like, all right, so like this is not just about data, right? This agent can make two calls. Like, okay, so if it's an HR policy agent, can it interact with marketing agents and get the work done? Or like, can it make a two call to Salesforce?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not just about data. It's not just about identity. It's also about like what kind of services and action, what kind of tool calls it can go and get access to. So kind of curious to hear a little bit more on your thoughts on the topic, Trey, around like you mentioned about how one agent talk to another agent and they need to pass the original context of the end user request. So we'd love to hear a little bit more on like what you mean by that and what your concerns there.
Well, the more we create agents, the more likely that they're going to need to work together, right? Like ultimately, if I need, and also it's also good to gain the scope of an agent so that you don't have an agent that just does everything, right? Like ultimately, it's a lot easier to control and contain what the agent is doing if its scope is fairly limited. That said, though, that increases the need for me to reach out to others, and ultimately, I see a day where there's I probably will end up with multiple agents in my space and maybe I have a patch agent, maybe I have an IAM agent, maybe I have a PAM agent, but there are things that are going to be needed to interact together. And currently, basically when I call, identity is an afterthought once I hit that first pass. Like I get to, I make the call to my agent. If that agent has to call anybody else right now, it's basically calling it as itself. So that's one of my biggest challenges is how do we it's almost like the flow, like the chain of command, the chain of custody, if you will, of the identity and the agent itself, and ultimately the task that it's being asked to perform. But you think about agentic, and one of the biggest differences is, back when I was automating things as a developer, I was automating specific steps. I had a goal in mind, but I was automating the specific steps. The system itself didn't have any idea what my end goal was. It just knew that it was being asked to do certain things. Nowadays, it's like, hey, agent, I need you to solve this problem. I need you, the goal is X. You can go figure out how to get to X, right? I don't really even care. Now, actually, I do. But ultimately, the intent is, we're able to let these things go and figure stuff out themselves because that's what they're really good at, like finding the data that we didn't know we had access to. There's all sorts of force multipliers that come in with this capabilities, but at the end of the day, there's it's just a lot of risk because the more hops you have and the more connections that you have, the more there's likelihood of something either being misappropriated, giving someone too much permission, giving someone, not enough permission. So there's all these levers that we need to figure out how to pull and how to set that we haven't really figured that out yet.
Yeah, definitely. Anything you want to chime in there, Anatoly, before
Yeah,
we?
Trey did a good job kind of covering overall. One thing, we don't need to dive into this, but we've used kind of examples of the agents like an HR agent, a bot, and things like that, right? But that's getting complicated now, right? With the whole clause, right? Not just open clause, but everything else that's coming in where agents now act autonomously, right? And they can take actions on your behalf and things like that. So it's getting, even more complicated than that, right? Because a lot of those boundaries, between agents, you can control to a certain degree, but then you kind of deploy different type of claw-like architecture within enterprises, agents that act on your behalf, and they don't need, to ask you a lot of permissions all the time. It just highlights just the importance of that, right? And then we talked about speed of change. Like we haven't been able to fully control the basics yet, and then new innovations are only coming and more is coming. So that's where it can kind of get overwhelming. So yeah, this space is continuing to change, and that boundary continues to stay important.
Yeah, I think you guys highlight a very important benefit and root cause right there, which is agents are non-deterministic, and that's the
Yeah.
nature of LM in general. And to your point, Trey, like in the past, you as a developer, you would automate certain step that is very deterministic. For example, you kind of transform one table to the next, or like you perform certain action, like the outcome is predictable. Now with the agent, it's a lot more unpredictable, and especially when it comes to agent communications, where like previously they have this concept of an MCP server where they use like natural language to communicate between agents, and just like human, right? Like if we do verbal, it's like he said, she said, right? Like something will go off the Gara in terms of the context, right? So I think at the end of the day, it's all get back to this. What's the intent of the agents? So because we cannot deterministically kind of like put guardrails around it, then it all get back to like what's the intent, and perhaps like it's functioning like more like a human organizations where you have different agents doing different things, and each agent have certain intent, certain KPIs that they need to perform, and so on. So I think that getting into the idea of like, all right, you cannot use the old principle of deterministic control to apply to something that is non-deterministic, and so
Yeah.
like this idea of intent become kind of like critical to govern and understand, and kind of like wanted to hear you guys thought on this.
Yeah, yeah. It just I mentioned this, like intent always was the is the problem, right? And what I mean by that, used to have, I don't know, I can't remember the name of the media player, right? But it was the intent of that software in your browser was just to play media, but some of the vulnerabilities that existed allowed somebody, a remote user, to obtain remote control of a device, right? Intent was play video. It was
Mhm.
never to actually allow somebody any kind of remote connectivity, but it happened. And that's what used to happen a lot. And that's how a lot of the, vulnerabilities, CVEs kind of get released, and you patch them and you deal with it. But now, like, you have a similar problem now, but it's again in a much bigger scale with a much less guardrails around agentic intent, right? So, uh, you know, what's important, I guess, how you deal with it, just capturing, at least knowing or logging what type of prompts are going into an agent, right? So if something happens, you can at least try to see what kind of prompt resulted in maybe a behavior that shouldn't have existed there, right? Another one is, again, some of these are just guardrails, and again, they can always be broken, right? But, ideally, whatever agentic systems companies design for their internal stuff, it's always build a step to validate the plan before it acts, right? So prompt engineering was really important thing before, but now it's getting easier and easier not to be disciplined around what prompts you put, and then agent kind of understands the intent, but before it fully executes, it's good for it to check with you, these are the steps I'm planning on doing, right? That type of planning checking can help maybe ground the intent, right? And then it's important to also not just let it run and kind of move away, right? But some of the whether it's Claude or others, agents are telling you, or they're showing you what they're trying to do, what their next step is, what commands they're executing. So I think that monitoring is still important, right? Having some oversight from a developer or somebody that understands what kind of architecture is happening. It's important to maintain that and have that visibility too. Where this can get dangerous, right? And again, it's all about enabling the business. But when you have, let's say, a marketing user or an HR user, trying for them to interpret, oh, it's going to execute this npm command or this shell script or this, they're not going to know, is it doing some things that I'm not supposed to be doing. So that's kind of eventually, our user base will have to get better educated as well
Mhm.
on knowing how to safely use these agents so that intent is achieved. But there's plenty of news articles that have happened out there. Oftentimes you can provide a harness, you can have a markdown file with clear instructions of what agents should or should not do. Sometimes they're overlooked, right? So that's just kind of some of the dangers there.
Well, and to your point, that there's you think about auditors. Like, hey, I had an auditor come in and ask me, why did an agent do that? I'm not going to know. Right. Like,
Right.
so, gathering, and, what gives us the honest answer is I don't know, but the real answer is there's metrics in there that we can gather. There's, at every hop, there is data that we can preserve that can help us understand why the decision was made or why certain things were done. But at the end of the day, those are, that doesn't exist today. So if my auditor came in and said, hey, you've got this fish agent that did XYZ, why did it do that? I don't know that I have a good answer for that right now.
Yeah, I think it's the entire industry is, to be honest, is learning, and even with Anthropic themselves, they are also learning. Like
Right.
as a company that we work closely with Anthropic and ChatGPT and OpenAI and Microsoft, like even from our side, what we observe is that these foundational model or providers, they are also learning as well. So unfortunately, the thing with AI is that things are moving so fast.
Yeah.
Right? Like we didn't talk about agents probably like from a year ago, I guess. Like now
Right.
it's like, oh, agents, agentics, and so on. It's just like a lot of crazy ideas out there on what the potential of agent is. So I think that kind of like we need to see like how um, businesses are adopting these new AI um, design patterns, and then from there, all right, what kind of security control that we have, and like there's like different line of defense, right? Like what you guys mentioned, like there may be an auditor, there may be some line control, and so on and so forth. And I feel like that's where we are at the industry right now, and I'm not sure if it is just us, but I think it's just the entire industry is still learning at this point.
Yeah. That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah. All right, so this is where it got interesting. We kind of touched base a little bit on that on the owner accountability, the identity piece.
Yeah. Sorry, James, what's the question?
Oh, you know my question. Like if the agent does something wrong, like who is responsible for it? Let's say that.
Oh yeah, well,
Yeah.
and we're talking. That's I think that's part of the challenge, right? And I think that data is the only answer here, right? So as we're building these agents, if they're agents that we built, ensuring that at least we're gathering enough information so that if we needed to, we can go back and determine why we made that decision. It's kind of like my security operations center team. Every incident we have, we put in a little bit of a blurb on this is why we thought that this was a minor or a major, or this is how this was the thinking behind. So I think that's something that we're going to have to build into these agents as we go, because ultimately having that audit trail of the why, I think is going to be really important. The challenge is it's not there right now, right? Like ultimately, I'm asking an agent to do something for me that I might not have access to do. And those are the kind of things that we need, we need very clear. The agent, maybe it stopped because it was smart enough to know that you didn't have access. That kind of stuff needs to be logged. So I think ultimately the best thing that we have to our advantage is just being very meticulous about how we are logging the why and the intent, creating this action chain so that we understand these are the things that happened. These are the reasons why they happened. Because ultimately those questions are going to be asked and we're going to be able to answer them. And hey, I had an agent that did its own thing and I have no idea what that was, is probably not a good answer for the auditors.
Yeah, well, I think just to add, right? So James, you mentioned, like, let's say there's an incident because it was caused by something an agent did, and where does the responsibility fall? Does it fall on IT, security, data owners, or the business, so to
And
speak? I think
yeah,
it.
and sorry to interrupt, Anatoly, and to make it specific, right? For example, in a lot of the companies that we work with, they have sensitive data that are regulated. Like for example, you work with healthcare, right? Like they have a lot of patient medical record data, or are you working with manufacturing company or in like or like different industry, like every company have different type of sensitive data, right? Like it can be
Yeah.
intellectual property, it can be
Mhm.
employee data, like when those got leaked, for example, what exposed, for example, like who is responsible for it, or like even agents go on and delete some records, like who responsible for it, right? So
yeah. And I think that there's a couple different stages of it to me. That's why, right? First of all, and if it already leaked, everything's out there, that's different. But if there's an active incident, right, or investigation needs to be done, definitely, security needs to jump in and make sure it's all hands on deck and investigate it. It doesn't matter why it happened. And the reason what I was trying to go to, you can have very governed agents that followed all the proper processes and IT developed, or development team developed it. All the rules were kind of there and things were tested. That's one world. But there's another world of business user did it and nobody knew that they did this, right? So those are two different ones. But to me, the message for me is, it doesn't matter, what agent did what. Ultimately, cybersecurity is responsible, for immediate remediation, immediate dealing. This is not the time to point fingers and say, hey, they didn't follow our process, right? But that's important. That's one. That's kind of immediate action. I think, I do believe it still sits within cybersecurity. Next question is, okay, so what are you going to do about it? What's next, right? Is there, and irrespective of if it was a governed agent or non-governed agent, is, you got to look at what controls you had, what failed, what policies need to be updated. So that also is owned by cybersecurity. Ultimately, it's kind of the post-mortem and kind of the creation of policies and controls. However, where the business owner kind of owns this is the business consequence that resulted because of this, right? Whether it's embarrassment, yeah, I'm not in a regulated industry, but embarrassment that some, proprietary information went out, or some customer information went out, or some kind of, there was a service downtime, right? So it's always kind of a partnership, and it's not finger pointing, and you got to figure out, but there's a shared responsibility, and business still owns the business outcome and the data and things like that, right? And just one quick thing, just to chime in additionally, there was always this concept historically, shadow IT, right? So we always thought, we're fighting, hey, things need to come through a governed way, and you got to be controlled, and you don't want some of the IT functions existing somewhere else, and that used to be called shadow IT. Well, what's happening right now today, IT organizations that are not changing the operating model, they risk to become the shadow IT. And what I mean by that is because everybody else is out there leveraging agents, creating these things, and nobody will come to you anymore for anything like that, right? So that's why it's a continued partnership, right? The kind of the lens is changing a little bit, but it's a shared responsibility. It just depends on where in that incident response you're at, of who takes the lead.
what do you
Great
think?
call out. No, that was really well said. No, I totally agree.
Yeah, and I feel like there's some lessons for the past that we can learn on how to govern agents, right? Like what Anatoli said around, like, all right, if incident happen, it's not a time for finger pointing. It's a time for, like, all right, what do we do about it? Like, how do we fix this? And then there's post-mortem of, like, what can we do better next time?
Yeah,
And
blindless
so
postmortems. It's a good thing.
exactly. So all get back to this kind of like, all right, what kind of processes, what kind of policy, what kind of governance tool that you do, and it's actually like these patterns of thinking is similar to, I suppose, like, let's say some employees make a mistake, right, and they make that, like, you would apply like similar framework. It's just that, in the agentic world there's certain variation of it and you need to do, right, in terms of like how you govern it and stuff like that. So I tend to agree a lot with what you guys said there. So in terms of adopting and enabling the business to adopt agentic in the agentic area, like what advice would you guys have for the CISOs, for the other companies out there? Maybe we'll start with Trey.
Oh gosh. There is yeah, I mean ultimately I think there's a couple of things that are really important. I think that we're talking about timeline, 90 days. If to say somebody came to you and said, "Hey, I want to roll out a program in 90 days." I think that the important thing to understand is it's going to take more than 90 days probably to understand everything. You can certainly have your your policies created, but when you get to that 90 days and we actually get something into place, there's definitely going to be a lot of work that's going to be needed post that to truly mature the space. But I mean, we got to understand your identity. You got to understand how are we going to audit what the identity perspective of it. So ensure that you've got a lot of this stuff. Honestly, goes back to hygiene. AI is this wonderful new tool, but it's really good at pointing out the lack of hygiene. Right? If you don't have good hygiene, a lot of this stuff just flat isn't going to work. So make sure that you've got your hygiene up with your identity, understanding the how are you going to manage those identities when something bad happens, and you need to understand why, how it happened. Building out those, the first things you want to do is build out policies on what you're going to be capturing within your agents to make sure that when something does happen, I've got the data I need to figure out why it happened. And then try to do something with a minimum viable product, right? Like ultimately, let's just find something. Quick wins, I think, is a great way to introduce these things. So finding ways to find a small problem to solve. Let's go after that. Don't try to boil the ocean, because nothing good's going to come out for that. And then ultimately identifying you got to identify the framework that you want to use. We were lucky; we're a NIST shop to begin with, so we're using the NIST AI, the framework. So you got to figure out what that framework needs to be, because ultimately that's going to guide you on how you go down that path. But so I think framework, identity, and then just trying to find some early wins, I think would be my advice to somebody new starting out.
Yeah, and I think that's very good, right? Especially the early wins portion of it. Like what you want to do is to like roll out for some and just learn and observe, because the space so new. Like if you wait
Yeah.
for a long time for the security posture to mature, it's probably a little bit late, right? Like, as opposed to
Yeah.
like roll out to very tech savvy users that you know that you can work with and collaborate and form a policy and so on. And I think that could be helpful. And during that process, right, you can observe like, is it like identity, right? But also agent involved data, like what kind of data it gets access to, what kind of tools call it can do, right? So like this idea of like having the context about the agent itself, like identity, data, tool call, instruction, who interacting with it, like what you mentioned earlier, Trey, about the chain of commands, right? Like how
Mm-hmm.
all kind of like weave together. I
Yeah.
think really good observation, and kind of curious to hear what Anatoly have in mind in terms of like how to adopt AI safely, securely, and fast.
Yeah, and I think the question was also, hey, if somebody like a peer was kind of starting out now, what can they do in 90 days, right? But a lot of it for me, it always comes down to visibility first, right? But what do I mean? Is trying to understand, what's an inventory? Like, what type of agents are you already deployed in your environment that you don't even know about, or what kind of needs exist in the business that they're wanting to, right? So maybe that agent might not be available right now, but there's a lot of need, so they'll jump at the first opportunity to sign up for something like that from a third party or try to build it internally. So I think somehow understanding that is important. And the next would be also then telemetry, right? More of the visibility from logs, and what can you see. There's different, all the different providers are trying to solve this problem by giving you some kind of telemetry data on what's happening in your environment. So I think taking advantage of whatever might be available is important. So just trust but verify, so to speak, right? So oftentimes just asking people or just trying to identify what agents might exist in your environment are just never enough. And so because you cannot govern, you cannot control something that you do not see or you're not aware of it. So to me, like 90 days is how do you get visibility into what's going on. And along the way, just to double click on what Trace, like, figure out the identity piece as well, like along the way, right? As you discover these things, then kind of try to trace, okay, what type of information it has access to, how is identity controlled. So those are important aspects. And honestly, the next one would be try to stay very up to date on what's happening every day, whatever your resource might be for something, right? Is it X, is it Reddit, is it trying to see what are the most popular GitHub repositories. Is it LinkedIn? Doesn't matter. It's just like what you knew, like right now today, it's gonna be already kind of stale information in a couple of days, right? So just being very, if you're in this field and you don't like to kind of stay up to date with developments that are happening, you're gonna get behind, right? So
Yeah.
so those are kind of the things that I think are important starting out.
That's one thing to double click on there, Anatoli, is I see myself as a resource for our business teams because there's so much going on in this space. I feel like it's our responsibility to keep up with everything that's happening so that we can educate our business on the art of the possible. I've never seen anything change as much as AI has. I kind of enjoy it. I enjoy seeing what the new stuff is going on. It's a very exciting time to be in our space. And yeah, I really I appreciate that you appreciate that, because it takes a lot of effort just to stay up to date on all the craziness that's going on.
Right, for sure.
Yeah, and I can attest to that. So I live in Silicon Valley. Our office is across the street from NVIDIA GTC conference.
Yeah.
And
Nice.
during NVIDIA GTC conference, like 10,000 people come here. Like even that I live in the heart of all of this, I still having a hard time to catch up with like what's the latest thing, right? Like obviously the talk of the town right now is Mitos, right? Like what is it
Yeah.
doing to AI, and there's agentics, and there's so many topics that keep popping up. And I think that a lot of those who eventually settle, then the challenge it become like, all right, what's the new risk that I should be worried about, and kind of like stay up to date. And it's just that open chat AI and agentic AI move so fast. It's also force us from a security standpoint to be moving fast. Like we cannot be lagging behind. So I think that's
Yeah,
a
one thing I'll tell you, James, something you said, you mentioned that this might settle. I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel yet, right? This is a long tunnel. Yes, eventually we'll come out the other end, but I don't see the settling light yet. It's only getting darker and darker. And what I mean by that, just the pace, right? Just the pace is breaknecking speed right now. A lot of these, frontier companies, are vying for IPOs, and there's going to be infusion even of more cash, right? More reasons to justify new innovations, more reasons to take more risks, right? So I don't know. It'll be nice time when it gets there, but right now this is a roller coaster, right? So
Yeah, it's like we're so far into the tunnel that we look around, we don't see the light at
that's
either
right.
end. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm down.
you're
I'm
just
down.
feeling your way down. You're moving somewhere. I
Yeah,
think we're going forward, though. We're definitely going forward.
that's a great analogy. Love it. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, with that, it's a good closing for us for the webinar. Appreciate, great to have you, Trey and Anatoly. I enjoyed the conversations and look forward to the next one.